Investigative journalist Seymour Hersh has put out an explosive story.
The President and the White House told us about the killing of Osama bin Laden is a lie.
Pakistan actually took place, but there is that
I understand the consequences of saying what I'm saying.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media developments we're tracking this week. The bin Laden story. It's back in the news. Some recent history under the journalistic microscope. As Cuba gets set to come in from the cold, what will that mean for the island's news media? Survivor, the Charlie Hebdo cartoonist who's had enough. And
stare into the screen! Look at your phone!
Taking the rap for being addicted to our mobile phones. We begin with the coverage of a story that broke 4 years ago this month, the killing of Osama bin Laden. From the day, May 2nd, 2011, that U.S. President Barack Obama revealed the news, there have been varying accounts of exactly what happened, including a few cracks in the official narrative. However, most of the media have told Washington's version of the story, as did Hollywood. Over the past week, though, that version has been challenged by one of America's best-known investigative reporters, Seymour Hersh. He reported that it wasn't a case of the CIA tracing bin Laden to that compound outside Abbottabad. According to Hersh, a Pakistani intelligence officer gave up bin Laden. He did it for the reward money, and the Pakistani government not only knew that the raid was coming, but had in fact been keeping the al-Qaeda leader prisoner for nearly 5 years. Hersh's journalism came under immediate attack, and the most vociferous response did not come from the Obama administration or Congress, but the U.S. press corps. We're going to examine why that is. Why, with a story that's been murky from the beginning, there is such a reluctance in the American media to even entertain the account of a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who has broken some of the biggest scandals America's seen over the past 50 years. What are Seymour Hersh's critics defending exactly? The government they report on, their own journalism, or is it a bit of both? Our starting point this week is Washington.
A small team of Americans carried out the operation with extraordinary courage. After a firefight, they killed Osama bin Laden and took custody of his body.
Most Americans reading Seymour Hersh's 10,000-word account of the killing of Osama bin Laden were seeing a version of the story they had never seen before. Most American journalists were reading things they had never reported before.
It's the way that the story was presented that's caused such a sort of visceral reaction from other journalists. He comes right out in the first paragraph and says everything that we've been told about the raid is a lie. So that's sort of a challenge to every other journalist who's covered this story to say, and that's the ultimate insult to suggest that you've been completely spun by a White House conspiracy.
All of that would have to be untrue, other than the helicopter going down, for your account to be true.
The reaction to Hersh's report shows that American journalists are basically reliant on what defense and intelligence officials tell them. And if you're a journalist in Washington, all you can do is ask the Pentagon, the CIA, the White House, the State Department, and other agencies what they make of these alternate reports. And if they stick by the original story, that's what you have to say.
The second reason is that Hersh has such an outsized reputation. This is the legendary reporter. This is a person who has been known for breaking extremely important stories, including the My Lai massacre in Vietnam and the Abu Ghraib story in Iraq. And so when a reporter with that kind of standing and with that kind of stature makes a bad move or missteps,
but there is that hole, frankly, in the narrative.
It's only natural for his peers and many younger reporters and journalists and analysts to step in and, in a sense, want to take him down for that.
Consider the source. That is a fundamental rule of journalism, and on this story, it starts with where Seymour Hersh's story was published. It wasn't in the New Yorker magazine or another U.S. outlet. It was published overseas, in the London Review of Books, the LRB. Some have theorized that the LRB's editorial standards, like double-checking the facts, are not up to those in the U.S. We put that to the publication, which replied, several fact-checkers have been employed on Hersh's pieces for the LRB, both staff members here and freelancers working from America. Both have experience at many publications, including the New York Times and the New Yorker. We have full confidence in the process. Then there's the sourcing in the story itself. Much of it hinges on a single source, an unnamed retired U.S. intelligence official.
If you're going to claim the President of the United States, the Director of the CIA, and their staffs and aides have been lying for years, you better be able to bring a pretty cogent case to undercut what they've been saying. And having one anonymous intelligence official in the story does not upset the storyline that the President has been giving in Washington for all this time. You need more to be able to make that case.
Some journalism professor should take this apart. Let's count the number of single source stories in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or any other major newspaper. They're just everywhere. Single source stories. If you're talking to the spooks and the intelligence people, you are not going to get names. This is understood. Why is that acceptable in the New York Times and it's not acceptable when Seymour Hersh does it?
And so while it's true that everybody does it, that doesn't mean we should accept it from anyone. And also you have to look at the way in which his sources describe with relation to particular facts. In some cases, Hersh will say that he had secondhand knowledge of it or that he had heard about it from somebody who'd heard about it. So it's not just the fact of the single source, but also how that source's access to information was described.
Hersh's story is sprinkled with some other named sources, and he quoted another Pakistani, Imtiaz Gul, who has written extensively on intelligence matters. Hersh quoted Gul's book, saying that Gul had spoken with 4 Pakistani intelligence sources who said that the Pakistani military must have known that the raid was coming. However, Gul takes issue with that interpretation of his work.
He just wanted to find a corroborating, a substantiating quote for his claims. All I had said was that possibly there were sympathizers, empathizers within the military and civilian establishment who were possibly keen to see Osama bin Laden alive, and they made sure that he continues to receive his line of supplies. But nothing beyond that. My conclusion was that possibly these sympathizers knew about the presence of the family, but not necessarily of Osama bin Laden himself.
However, that argument is contradicted by Carlotta Gall, former Pakistan correspondent for the New York Times. Last year, she reported that an unnamed Pakistani military officer revealed bin Laden's whereabouts to the U.S., and that the former al-Qaeda leader was in Abbottabad under the protection of Pakistani intelligence. After Hersh's story came out, Gall wrote, "I cannot confirm Hersh's bolder claims, but I would not necessarily dismiss the claims."
Gall was speaking about elements in the Pakistani military being in the know, knowing that bin Laden was in fact in Pakistan and having worked to hide him. Now that in fact does strike many people as plausible. The part that Hersh brings up, which Carlotta Gall did not, and no one else had, was the idea that the US was willingly cooperating with elements in the Pakistani military to dupe the American public. And the Pakistani military was, in fact, in on the raid.
Carlotta Gall, she's a pretty conscientious correspondent. And she kind of, as we say in the trade, she flicked at this. She flicked at the fact that certain Pakistanis knew of bin Laden's presence, whereabouts. But she left it there. And in the way media and audiences interact, it was left unremarked. In other words, she did not take it head on. It was not actually her story. Her story went off elsewhere. Hersh made it his story.
Those who remain dubious about Seymour Hersh's story, and they are legion,
because I had to put it down. I couldn't read the nonsense.
Argue that it beggars belief, that a conspiracy that wide, involving that many officials in the US and Pakistan, is just too big to keep secret. However, that argument has a self-defeating aspect to it. Had Hersh granted our interview request, which he didn't, his response might have been something along the lines of, well, it's not a secret anymore. On the download this week, our viewers on the ongoing coverage of the Osama bin Laden story.
Seymour Hersh is certainly no stranger to directing criticism at the media. So I think they see his latest investigation really as a sort of backhanded attack on their reporting. And the easiest means of answering back to that is to emphasize the shortcomings of his methods and ultimately dismiss the investigation as claptrap.
Other media stories on our radar this week. The sole surviving cartoonist at the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo has announced he's quitting. Renaud Louzier, who joined the publication in 1992, told the newspaper Libération that working at Charlie Hebdo had become too much to bear, that each issue is a torture because others are gone, referring to the 12 colleagues who were killed in January when gunmen attacked the magazine's offices in Paris. Louzier, who draws under the name of Luz, was spared only because he was running late that day. He was among a group at the publication who then co-wrote an op-ed for Le Monde 2 months after the shooting, expressing concerns about the editorial direction of the magazine. He also said at that time that he would no longer draw cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, not because he had been intimidated, he said, but because the work no longer interested him. A BBC reporter and his crew were detained in Qatar while filming a story on working conditions for migrant workers there. Earlier this month, Mark Lobel and his team joined a group of international journalists invited to Doha to cover the story, which has been reported widely ever since Qatar won the right to host the FIFA World Cup in 2022. But when Lobel's team tried to gather some extra material in locations not included on the official tour, they were arrested.
Our camera and footage was seized.
The reporter, who spent 2 days in jail with his team, has now been released and is back in the UK. The BBC said, "We deplore the fact that they were detained in the first place. Their presence in Qatar was no secret, and they were engaged in a perfectly proper piece of journalism. We are pressing the Qatari authorities for a full explanation and for the return of the confiscated equipment." Qatar issued its own statement. "We gave the reporters free rein to interview whomever they chose and to roam unaccompanied in the labor villages." Perhaps anticipating that the government would not provide this sort of access, the BBC crew decided to do their own site visits. And in doing so, they trespassed on private property, which is against the law in Qatar, just as it is in most countries. Security forces were called, and the BBC crew was detained. An Azerbaijani investigative journalist who exposed government wrongdoing and corruption has had her court detention extended in Baku. Khadija Ismailova, who was a contributor for Radio Free Europe, was arrested in December of last year on charges of inciting a former colleague to attempt suicide, tax evasion, and something called abuse of power. She had previously reported on human rights abuses in Azerbaijan and corruption, specifically the financial activities of the family of President Ilham Aliyev. Nenad Payic, the editor-in-chief at Radio Free Europe, whose offices in Baku were closed when Ismailova was arrested, said her imprisonment has nothing to do with any wrongdoing or law. It is about silencing Khadija by any means necessary. During her court appearance, Ismailova told reporters there, "I expect good investigative journalism from you. I am strong. Do not worry about me." Ismailova is one of roughly 10 journalists jailed in Azerbaijan for reporting critically on the government there, which observers say is very image conscious these days with the European Summer Games scheduled for Baku in August. Her next court date happens to be slated for August 24th, just after the Games conclude. Here at the Listening Post, we've covered media stories all over Latin America, Argentina, Venezuela, Brazil, Ecuador, and Honduras, to name just a few, but we've never gone to Cuba. It's a notoriously difficult place to get accreditation, let alone talk to journalists. Most of the media on the island are state-run. It's been that way ever since the revolution in 1959, when Fidel Castro overthrew the U.S.-backed Batista government with a socialist one that's still in place. Many dismiss the media in Cuba as mere relics of its Cold War past, Soviet-style propaganda machines designed to control the masses. Now there's a diplomatic transition underway, a rapprochement with the U.S., aimed at ending decades of animosity between the two countries. As the relationship with Washington changes, Cuban media outlets like Granma, Juventud Rebelde, Radio Havana will undoubtedly change too. There's already been some reform and opening up of Cuban media. Accreditation and access are easier to get. Officials are more open to talking, although there are still plenty of red lines the journalists there know better than to cross. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro from Havana now on the media landscape, the changes taking place, and what it all means for journalism in Cuba.
To To understand the story of Cuba and the media, you have to go back to the late 50s, when Che Guevara and Fidel Castro started broadcasting their revolutionary advance from a rebel hideout come makeshift radio station in the mountains of Sierra Maestra.
Aquí Radio Rebelde desde un punto de la Sierra Maestra en el territorio libre de Cuba.
Today, much of the state media remains the same. Granma, the official voice of the Cuban Communist Party, has been persistently purveying good news for 50 years now. And for those who sell it, print it, read it, it's played a key role in keeping the revolution alive.
Granma will continue forever. We will not give up on our achievements. People sacrificed their lives for the revolution, so we're going to keep Granma because we don't want anything that goes against our ideology. Our ideology is a revolutionary one, unlike in any other country.
Fidel has always seen the strategic importance of the media, ever since Radio Rebelde started broadcasting from the mountains of La Sierra as a way of getting the message out about the revolutionary struggle against the Batista dictatorship.
You can only understand the Cuban Revolution properly if you understand the relationship between the country's leadership and the people. That began with Fidel talking to the million people who would gather in Revolutionary Square. But then it spread to media like TV and this newspaper, Granma. It was through this newspaper that some of the country's key decisions were announced. Fidel would come here himself and write pieces to announce new laws as they were being passed.
For years, that level of involvement fed into criticism that Castro was a one-man show and no friend of the free press. It's unlikely he would have disputed that. It was very much part of how he and his co-revolutionary, Che Guevara, envisioned the role of the media for the revolution. And that has its own history, which goes back to Guatemala and the 1954 CIA-funded coup that deposed the democratically elected president. Che Guevara was there and saw how one of the most important weapons in the CIA's artillery was a clandestine radio station, La Voz de la Liberación, the voice of liberation. It was a turning point for Che Guevara. In an interview conducted after the revolution with a Colombian journalist, he said, "We have to get rid of all newspapers, because you can't have a revolution with press freedom. Newspapers are the instruments of the oligarchy." When Fidel Castro came to power here in 1959, he was only too aware of how important the role of state media would be in propagating the message of the revolution. Outlets like Granma and Juventud Rebelde have been leading that story ever since. A wariness and a suspicion of outsiders has been hardwired into these outlets, but that's changing, otherwise we wouldn't be here. Editorial nuance is changing too, about what can and can't be said. Those changes came when Raúl Castro replaced his brother Fidel as president and surprised many by taking a different approach to the media. In 2011, he made a key speech calling for the end to secrecy in Cuba's journalism. It sounded promising, but in practice, it was far from being Cuba's glasnost. Reporters Without Borders, the Paris-based media watchdog, publishes an annual index ranking all 180 countries on their record for freedom of the press. In 2011, the year Raúl Castro made that speech, Cuba was 167th on the list. That's 13th from the bottom. 4 years later, Cuba's ranking has gone down, not up, to 169.
Raúl made a call to end all secrecy, because in Cuba there have been many forbidden areas of information that blurred the boundaries of what might become hurtful for the revolution. If any country tried to deal with Cuba, and the United States knew about it, these countries were punishable by law because of the blockade imposed on Cuba. That meant the Cuban press closed itself too much. But today, we are aware of that and of the importance that the Cuban press has for the Cuban people.
This notion of Cuban journalism being characterized by secrecy should be understood in the context of an island under siege. and what that implies whenever the revolution's project is perceived to be under threat. Of course, this is also used as an excuse by some in the government when they make mistakes and want to avoid being held to account.
Since 1974, Cuba has applied a model of press control based on the Soviet one. The Central Committee's ideological department has the job of supervising the media, and its position differs from that of Raúl Castro's. That's why whenever Raúl Castro says that the media need to take a more critical attitude, the department steps in and threatens to dismiss more independently minded journalists. So there's a real duality going on at the moment.
Esa dualidad es la que se está dando en este momento.
Fernando Ravsberg should know he's often fallen foul of the Cuban authorities for publishing pieces on Cuba's sacred cows, education, health, political leadership. Cuban policy on the media may seem a bit paranoid, but Cubans have their reasons. Located just 90 miles away from its ideological enemy, it's seen a US invasion, Bay of Pigs in '61, multiple assassination attempts on Fidel Castro, including one involving an exploding cigar. Radio Martí, a US-funded broadcaster set up with the sole purpose of undermining the Castro government. And most recently, a digital twist, a secret social media program called Zunzuneo, or Cuban Twitter, designed to foment Arab Spring-like protests in the country. It was masterminded not by the CIA, but by USAID, which is meant to deliver humanitarian aid. That drew sharp criticism from Congress.
Were you aware of this program in Cuba?
No, absolutely not. And if I had been, I would have said, what in heaven's name are you thinking?
Text messages were being sent to young people to promote some sort of implosion within. They were expecting the country's youth to rebel against the government, and it was hoped that what happened in Libya and Syria would be imitated here. New technologies, such as Facebook and Twitter, were used to try and foment those so-called springs.
But with a historic announcement, a diplomatic breakthrough, the iconic image of that handshake between Obama and Castro, this story arc has moved. From Cold War to political thaw, and a changing scenario for public debate in Cuba, with old binaries defrosting, albeit at a glacial speed.
Está habiendo un movimiento, es lento.
So there's a change going on. It's just going to take time. It's going to be slow because the system in place has too much power to marginalize its critics. I can assure you that there are plenty of colleagues here in Cuba who are desperate to be doing a different kind of journalism.
As long as we have a growing debate about the model of development we want for our country, as long as there are different perspectives, more people working out options as to what path to take, the less risk we have of making wrong decisions.
Growing debate, different perspectives, new voices, in a developing story that was once penned by one editor-in-chief. It remains to be seen how Cuba will write the next rough draft of its history, revolutionary or otherwise. But there are plenty of contributors ready, waiting to file their reports.
Finally, there's this theory out there. It's about zombie movies and why it is that that one particular film genre has recently grown so popular. The theory has it that these days people spend so much time on their mobile phones trudging around like zombies that they've come to identify with the characters in those movies. Before the mobile era, people did a lot more talking, a lot more interacting, rather than just staring at their phones all the time. The people at the New York-based YouTube channel Barely Political and comedian Todd Womack have put together a rap video on mobile phones and just how zombified we've become. And if you're watching this on your mobile, get your head up. Watch where you're going. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
Oh, now we all be like, I gotta look at my phone. It's the most important thing I think I ever have owned. Somebody could fall over. Yo, this dude is dying. And you be like, shh, I'm in the middle of FaceTiming. Stare into the screen. Look at your phone. It's everything you need. Look at your phone. So much better than a friend. Look at your phone. It's calling you again. Look at your phone. I really like could sell my phone directly to my face and be part of some future shit galactic super smartphone race. But my doctor didn't focus when I told him my idea, cause I think he was too busy buying curtains from IKEA. Now it ain't my game to call him out and be some sort of hater. Yo, I didn't even know he left until he tweeted later. But then my phone ran out of things to show me and I cursed. So I asked it what's the biggest secret of the universe. It showed me windows into space and time you can't imagine. Oh my god, I can't believe I'm finally in the matrix as my phone begins distilling life and meaning into basics. This could fix the heavy global problems that exist, but it looks like irony is gonna make me fall off a cliff. Look at your phone. Siri, I need help. Look at your phone.
Searching the web for help.
Look at your phone. No, help, not kelp. Look at your phone.
I'm not sure I understand.